We've been sitting in an elevated chair staring down at something, whether it's your desk, your homework, or whatever, and being told to sit still or just kind of be in our brains since we were probably 7 years old. It doesn't really matter what your background is. If you're a modern day person, you bring a lot of baggage to movement. How do we approach movement in a way that's different from just going straight to the sexy stuff or trying to just do physical therapy? And that is, we just get back to our roots. We continue the process that we started when we were younger, which is we just move and we let our environment sharpen us.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Breaking Muscle Podcast, where we bring you fresh perspectives on what it means to be fit and healthy. I am Pete Hitzman, the managing editor over at BreakingMuscle.com and your host for today's show. Most modern training programs are variations on the same scientific themes. You take a human body and measure its capacity. Then you subject it to repeated measurable stresses, rest, recover, repeat. After a certain duration of this pattern, you test the body again, and if the program was effective, you have a quantifiable improvement. This is a great way to do science, but is it the best way to build capability? Will your back squat translate to escaping a burning building? Will a better 5K time keep you from falling down the stairs? The only honest answer is maybe, and no honest coach would assert that their specific strength and conditioning programs will develop your entire range of human capability and capacity. So what does fitness really mean if we're only going to target a certain percentage of what your body was built to do? The functional fitness movement has been an effort to answer that question, but it still relies on largely the same tools: a perfectly flat gym floor, perfectly symmetrical weights, and smooth constant diameter bars, and repeated measurable stresses. While it looks different at first glance, functional fitness falls into many of the same mold traps. Danny Clark is the performance director for MovNat, a comprehensive training system whose core philosophy is that if you want to develop the most capable humans, you should regularly engage the broadest possible range of their capability. To do that, says Danny, you need to get out of the gym that humans built and into the gym that nature has always provided. He sat down with me to discuss MovNat's origins in evolutionary history and the advent of physical culture in France in the early 1900s. We discussed the costs of the rapid advance of technology on our physical utility and how true movement competence comes from engaging our natural environment. He explains how his martial arts experience informed his thoughts on movement quality and how his frustration with the inability of typical gym exercises to address the complex needs of his clients led him to a beach in Mexico. Last, we cover some easy and practical ways to incorporate natural movement into your existing fitness practice. Before we jump into the interview, I want to say thanks to all of you who have jumped on board with the show so far. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play, and while you're there, leave us a rating and a review. These go a long way to helping us get the word out to help grow the audience. Last, if you have any feedback or suggestions for future guests, send them over to editorial@breakingmuscle.com. Our guest today on the Breaking Muscle Podcast is Danny Clark. Danny Clark works for MovNat, which is a natural movement exercise system, fitness system way of interacting with the world, it sounds like. Danny, thank you so much for your time and for sitting down with us today.
Hey, brother. Thanks so much for having me on. So excited to be here.
So what is natural movement? This sounds like a question that should answer itself, but it really is something quite specific.
Sure. So natural movement, quite simply, is just the movements that our bodies were designed to do from an evolutionary perspective. Throughout our evolutionary history, we had certain tasks that we had to perform in our natural world to be able to survive. And so our bodies over time have adapted to those tasks. So really, quite simply, natural movement is doing those exact movements. So that's, there's a bunch of different categories we draw from. We're looking to get the full spectrum of natural movement, which includes lifting, but we also extend it out to, starting with ground movement, that being able to sit on the ground, being able to transition, being able to get up, being able to crawl, being able to, go from there to gait patterns, being able to balance, being able to walk, being able to run, being able to sprint, lifting and carrying, throwing and catching, climbing, jumping, vaulting. So what we're looking to do is practice the whole breadth of what would be considered natural from that evolutionary perspective.
This is obviously not the first fitness system to approach things that way, to approach things in a way that tries to engage the entire physical system, right? But you guys have taken it sort of a step further, or maybe even a step back in history. So there's some historical grounding for the type of movements that you guys are working. Can you kind of talk about where that came from?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say that, MovNat is the first system that I've ever seen anyway to focus on totally practical movements that all have a direct purpose towards accomplishing some sort of task in either modern or evolutionary environments. And this sort of stems from, we have a history, it's not something that we just invented magically one day. There's a history of this, especially in Europe and specifically in France. MovNat's founder or MovNat in general has similar origins to parkour. Most people are a little bit more familiar with what parkour is, right? So, with parkour, you see a lot of agility-based stuff where there's, a lot of climbing, jumping, and vaulting and running, essentially. And, what MovNat did was broaden that out to include all natural human aptitudes. And both lineages stem from the same source, which is a French naval officer, the late Georges Herbet, who lived in the 1800s, the 1900s. And what Georges Herbet did was he, through his observations of A, working with hunter-gatherer populations, and B, working in disaster scenarios, just made the observation that as we've become more technologically advanced, humans have generally become less capable. And that capability, while important for our health and all that, really has a vital component to it. And that vital component is, in survival situations, you need to be able to save your own skin and be able to be useful for other people. So he noted that people couldn't get on a raft anymore with any sort of grace in any way. They couldn't lift and carry other people. And generally, our physical abilities that we're sort of born with, that in a more natural setting, in the settings he observed hunter-gatherers, and we don't have these. We don't practice gymnastics in natural settings. We don't, pump iron or anything like that. But these people have these amazing abilities. They have grace. They have they're strong. They have a lot of conditioning. They're generally capable human beings. So his vision was to be able to take that more natural perspective on movement and bring it into a modern phenomenon, which is the fact that technology is not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to be able to use our own technology, our own biotechnology that is our body. So he created this system called the natural method, which was just being a kind of take these movements that we used to have to do from an evolutionary perspective and sort of turn them into a practice, a tangible way for people to train, especially in the military, to make sure that they're physically capable in life.
You touched on a word there, or a phrase there that I want to hone in on, because I think it's the distinguishing characteristic of MovNat versus a lot of other fitness regimes, and that's a generally capable human.
Mm-hmm.
So in our world, in the fitness industry world, there's this emphasis on the specific aspects of fitness, right? So if you want to develop your cardiovascular fitness or your muscular endurance or your general strength or your functional fitness. And so the functional fitness world, as it's come up, has sort of moved in a direction back toward natural movement, but never really quite got there. I feel like they kind of stayed in that gym space where we're going to do these very specific things. We're going to develop these energy systems.
Yeah, I know you're touching on, because I think that the industry is evolving right toward natural movement, because we recognize that by just isolating our physiology, that being strength and conditioning, by just isolating, instead of isolating muscles, we sort of are now for a while drawing on isolating our physiology. So let's play up our aerobic system. Let's play up our strength. Let's play up our conditioning. And that's in a lot of ways what GPP and CrossFit aim to do, is really enhance our physiology to be able to do whatever we want to do in life. And that's really good. I think the functional movement perspective sort of analyzes that and says, well, there's still a lot missing, because just by, to get strong, I could just deadlift, to just run, to just improve my conditioning, I could just run. And to improve my flexibility, I could just sort of do yoga or stretch. But is that really adding up to something that's really, truly useful in our daily lives or in our sport or whatever? Is it really honoring the function of our joints? Mm-hmm. And I think we start to attempt to, as a response to the problem that comes with some strength and conditioning, the joint, health that a lot of trainers have to deal with when people either A, have a long background in strength and conditioning, or B, clients that haven't moved in a long time. We add in some PT or foam rolling or whatever to try to just address, like, okay, this person doesn't need to just get stronger or more conditioned. There's something missing. So I think that's really what functional fitness is trying to reconcile. Mm-hmm. But in the absence of understanding the importance of environment, what the key role that environment plays in shaping movement, we sort of just get to this, like, okay, we'll do any random movement to try to get our joints to move through space in a bigger range of motion than we do with a deadlift and running, right? So that's what functional fitness is to me. Now, natural movement is a totally different perspective. Instead of just trying to fill in the blanks, what we're doing is, instead of isolating our physiology, that being, again, our aerobic, our strength systems, all that kind of stuff, our powers, all these different systems, what we're doing is we're really trying to improve movement competence, which happens at the level of the brain. And movement competence doesn't happen just by doing random movements. It happens by interacting with your environment. So your environment is what creates good movement. So if you have a really rich environment, that being you have unstable surfaces, you have slippery surfaces, you have a lot of dynamic movement that has to happen. Just like in a sport, with a complex sport like mixed martial arts, for example, that's going to really sharpen your ability to move, because you have a lot of inputs coming in and your brain has to really deal with, how do I do this better? So in short, I think that functional fitness is a movement in the right direction to try to address other issues that people try to solve when they try to come to fitness to move better, to feel better, or to accomplish any particular goal. But natural movement is what addresses the brain component of it, that being movement competence, that being, neuroplasticity, that being all the good stuff that happens when you learn how to move your body more naturally.
You mentioned a rich environment there, and I think that's a really interesting and important concept, because if you walk into most gyms, including most functional fitness gyms, they're a very sterile environment in terms of the challenges your body can encounter. At first glance, it might look like there's a lot of stuff there that's going to challenge you, but when you really break it down, they're kind of all the same. Like, all the bars are the right diameter for you to hang on to. All of the things move perfectly and they're perfectly balanced. The floor is perfectly flat and has adequate grip, So it's not necessarily going to be a place that's going to make you more capable, because it's not presenting the challenges that the natural world is going to present to you.
No, a lot of strength and conditioning is about reducing variables and creating better outcomes. So what you do is you reduce the variables to make sure you can isolate strength and improve it. So a level barbell, you're going to be able to quantify and improve your lifting numbers and prove that you improved your strength by sterilizing it in a way. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of benefit to that. I'm not saying that's not a good practice, but it's just one side of the equation. You hear me say the word capability a lot, and that's like that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. But what is capability? What does that mean? So that's something we talk a lot about at MovNat. What does it mean to be capable? And the way that we answer that is we say that capability is where we find movement competence and movement capacity in the same place. So we're not just in MovNat suddenly trying to make you move just better, more competently, with more balance, with more efficiency and precision. But there's a degree of strength and conditioning that is a part of being capable. So we try to address both sides of that equation. So to come back to the gym environment, the gym environment is tailored to be able to isolate. It's tailored to, at first, that's why you see bodybuilding equipment and machines, because it's about isolating muscles. Mm-hmm. A gym that's focused on strength and conditioning is about isolating strength variables or conditioning. You can measure it on a treadmill. You can measure it in a lot of different ways through circuits or conditioning or whatever. But the problem is movement competence is really hard to measure. So what we need to do to be able to measure it in a meaningful way is just create enriched environments and see how we can do to move better in those environments, see how we can improve over time. It's something that's observed. When you see, say, for example, I come back to MMA a lot, someone who's developed the efficiency of technique to move well and to be effective and efficient how they move, there's a smoothness to it. It's a quality, and it ultimately leads to success, right? It's the same with movement. So it's hard to measure and quantify movement competence, but it's very observable. When someone just has a quality about their movement, someone who uses good technique, somebody who can, go all the way from maintaining a neutral back with a deadlift, all the way to being able to crawl with good technique, to being able to climb on top of things, it's observable, and it's something that we work on, and we think it's a big part of athletic performance, and it's obviously a very big part of just life performance too.
Right. So you've referenced MMA a couple of times, and that's not by accident. You have a background in combat sports. So let's talk about where you came from, and then how did you get familiar with MovNat?
Yeah, sure. So I wrestled from a very early age, and I wrestled through college, and from there I transitioned into jiu-jitsu and did a little bit of MMA, although it just wasn't really my calling. So, I've been a martial artist my whole life. So I always sort of, understood that there's more to being able to be successful in something than lifting heavy or having a good running ability, a lot of measurable conditioning, right? I use that type of stuff like lifting and conditioning to supplement my athletic performance, but it was a very small part of performance, right? So, I also transitioned into a career in the fitness industry and used the strength and conditioning that I had learned, because that was the kind of, at that time, it was really mostly bodybuilding, but that was sort of the fringe thing to do, was to do functional training and more strength-based training. So, that's what I was doing with my clients. And I had a lot of success, but to me, that success was limited in my ability to help people move better outside of the spectrum of a deadlift, a squat, an upper body push and pull. Like, it just, it wasn't going beyond that in a lot of ways. And, a lot of clients don't come in with the goal of being at a deadlift super heavy. A lot of times we end up just putting our bias of, hey, this is a really good way to get fit on them. So, in order to help a 50 or 60-year-old, I was sort of forced in the long run to think outside the box, right? So like for a 50, 60-year-old, they've been sitting at a desk for a long time. Just loading them wasn't a good idea, right? Or even getting them to the basic hip hinge movements, being able to get them to do basic things was a big deal for them. But there was also a lot that was missing. So anyway, I personally just kept going down the rabbit hole of how can I help my clients better? And at the same time, I was dealing with some back injuries and some, despite having impeccable technique, or what I felt like was impeccable technique, still had lower back issues, some neck issues, some shoulder issues, and I was like, doing more of the same just isn't going to work. So I found this YouTube video called The Workout the World Forgot, and it's with MovNat's founder, Moving Through Nature. And there were some just incredible looking movements in there, and they were really agile and kind of awesome looking, and I couldn't do them even though I was super strong. So that kind of motivated me to be like, oh, there's something here at least to mine out of this. And I'm an outdoor enthusiast. I love nature and just being outside. So let me go check this out and see if there's something to this. And so I did. I went to a beach in Mexico to meet this very eccentric, awesome character named Erwan. And I was really blown away with what he was doing. Here's why. It wasn't just that it was like this aggro thing, like we're going to move through nature and be barefoot and be Tarzan. There was a little bit of that, which was kind of cool. But I'm a guy who thinks about systems, and there was an actual system, there was a logic, there was an underlying philosophy behind what was going on here. First of all, MovNat isn't just about moving outside, it's about developing efficiency and adaptability in movement. So when we think about a particular movement pattern, we don't just do it. It's good to do it, but we ask the question first, can you do this particular movement? Let's say it's a carry. I need to carry my 5-year-old half a mile. Okay, so the first question we ask is, can you do that? Is that even possible? Is that going to work? And for most people, hopefully, the answer is yes. Now, from the MovNat lens, we think, how can we make that more efficient? Instead of just loading it more and then hoping we get better at it, we think, how can we use technique and mindfulness and just consciousness to how we position our body? In the same way we refine a deadlift, we refine a carry to make it more efficient. Efficiency happens when we meet the highest level of performance possible, meets the lowest energy expenditure possible, meets also the highest level of safety possible. So if I'm doing that same movement effectively, but my back is super arched, I'm barely breathing, or I'm breathing really, stressed out, holding excess tension in my arms, I may be able to do it, but it wasn't very efficient. And MovNat, with every single movement we do, we always try to use through the application of technique, we try to improve it. How do we make this better? How do we use elements such as how can we change our position, our breathing, our sequence, our timing, and the balance of tension and relaxation to make this better, more efficient? And the last thing we do is we try to make that same pattern, once it's efficient, more adaptable. So more adaptable would mean, okay, that same movement, let's say you have to be able to carry your 5-year-old half a mile. What if there's obstacles in the way? What if you have to step over and under things? What if it's on sand as opposed to a street? What if you're barefoot? What if it's slippery out? Can you do it? Just because you could do it under perfect conditions, maybe in a gym, doesn't mean you can do it in the real world. So that's kind of the highest goal of MovNat, is first to develop efficiency, but ultimately to be able to handle contextual demands, just, again, obstacles or situational demands that, require you to be able to perform in higher level circumstances. So that's ultimately what it's about.
That's always been one of the things that kind of struck me as backwards or misprioritized, right? So one of CrossFit's things is, every once in a while you should get out of the gym and play with your fitness. And to me, that's the opposite of how that should work, right? You should be outside playing with your fitness all the time, and you go in the gym when you have to, I guess, or as a supplement to your fitness, not as the point of it.
And that's exactly what GPP was designed to do. GPP is the platform by which every, Division I strength coach, and even probably CrossFit coach, that's the lens that they're looking through, right? That was developed by the Soviets. It was about improving general fitness, right? It's about improving what was Glassman's definition?
Work capacity across broad time modal domains.
Exactly. Yes. Modal domains, work capacity. These are all fitness capacity based measures, power, agility, all this type of stuff. So, because that was its design, it was always designed to supplement athletic performance. In the early, Russian system, the process of sports mastery, you can read up on this. There's, really the early stages of that process for developing a child's athletic career was doing a lot of really, really fundamental movements, that not being squat, hinge, press, pull, that was crawling, climbing, jumping, really ultimately interacting with an environment and nature. That's why we say, kids be kids. But here's the thing, there's a benefit to continuing that into adulthood. There's a huge benefit to it. Sure, it makes you happy, it's fun, it's play. But when you approach it with it's great to be playful, but when you approach it with a method, with some systemization to it, with some progression, just like anything else, you can make it better. You can progress a lot faster. You can reach higher levels, and you can stay safer. And that's really what MovNat's about. Because we've found through research now that there's older aging adults are getting incredible improvements in their ability to move, to be able to, their working memory, which is tied to movement, improves things that regular deadlifting and even gymnastics can't really touch. So that's kind of the cool thing about it.
So on the one hand, you have the trouble with a scientific approach to fitness, right? So if you want to make everything measurable and quantifiable, and this is the trouble with science in general, right? Because you isolate a variable, you change that one variable, and sometimes if you're not careful, you lose the broader scope, or you lose the perspective on the whole system, or you create a whole bunch of unintended consequences. I was talking about this the other day with a friend of mine who's worried about his cholesterol numbers, and I was like, well, cholesterol numbers are only one metric, and you need to look at a whole bunch of other things to find out whether your cholesterol numbers are, to say that they're bad or good requires a much broader explanation than a single number. And that same problem exists in the fitness world, right? So we create this very measurable system, and one of the strengths of CrossFit is that everything is quantified, right? Every round, rep, time, weight, everything's got a number attached to it, and that makes it very easy to measure progress. But, as you're saying, if the progress isn't extrapolated into this broader scope, we might have made a human that is more fit but less capable. So the risk to your approach, though, is that you can't really quantify a lot of the things that you're doing. So how do you measure progress in the absence of easy quantification?
I think you use the power of quantification as well. We don't cut it off, I think that you can reduce and isolate and improve systematically without forgetting the bigger picture of reassembling it into something meaningful. So in the same, like MovNat doesn't mean that, I do MovNat now, so I can't touch a barbell. That's very blasphemous to my new system, right? So I personally, I've taken a lot of gems from the strength and conditioning world. That being the understanding of progressive overload, how to quantify, how to even structure programming using macro, meso, and microcycles to systematically improve something. We can take that same approach and we can apply it to natural movement too. Again, every single one of those domains you can somewhat to a degree measure, like your ability to jump, you can improve in a quantifiable way, not only just by how far you can jump, but how often, how frequently can I land with precision on a narrow surface. You can quantify that over time. But you're right, to a degree, there's things that are difficult to quantify. And again, that's where the development of efficiency is qualitative. It is. It's just, there's no real way around that. It's a phenomenon that's experienced and observed, but it is difficult to quantify. So I think the resolution to that is you quantify what you can and you improve it and you can structure it, and then you don't quantify what you can't quantify and you trust that it does have some significance because you'll feel it immediately. Further, we have active research going on to try to quantify it as much as possible. So, for example, at my last certification, we had a researcher using force plates to be able to measure before and after with just being able to get up off the ground, how these patterns, their ability to shift weight, their ability to execute the movement, how that changes over time with as they develop efficiency and movement. We can use tests like diagnostic tests like the FMS, the Y-balance test, or even just the regular FMS, or even Gray Cook's new FCS. We're actually working very closely with Gray to be able to quantify it as much as possible, right? So that's kind of what Gray does pretty well, and is quantify quality. That's what it is. So really, we're using that as a measuring stick, but even that is limited to a degree. At the end of the day, the best way to quantify is your actual ability to move through a natural environment over time. If you can't move outside off a trail without shoes on at all, because you keep falling, or because you lack the strength to be able to pull yourself up onto something, that's pretty, the environment's kind of self-limiting. That the more you train and you get better at that, the overall picture has improved too. So there's always that.
Or maybe your feet just really hurt. in my case, the barefoot thing is so alluring, but I don't know if I could pull it off because my feet are really sissy. Working on it.
Pull it off. It's the kind of thing. Just again, principles of progression, right?
Right.
Would I start someone on day one with a power clean who wants to lift? No, absolutely not. I'd start them with a simple hip hinge. Mm-hmm. With barefoot, you got to start just by walking or crawling without shoes on, and then when you do things like walking outside where there's more complexity, or running or loading your body more, that's when you wear shoes to start, and you gradually decrease the drop in the shoes. So there's a whole process, and there's skin conditioning, but that's what we do at MovNat. We don't just we always think, how can we systematically make this happen for somebody who wants it to happen? And there's so many benefits to that, of course.
And that's an important point to make, because if somebody goes on the website and watches the videos, I think a lot of people's initial reaction is going to be, this shit looks scary. Like, you're jumping off of rocks and you're tucking, rolling, and you're climbing trees and everything. And if you're the average sort of sit at a desk American who's just trying to make their lives better through a little exercise, it looks terrifying to go out and do all of these things. Like, nature is freaking scary to be in the first place because everything's trying to kill you. And then you're going to ask me to, like, jump off a cliff? Like, what are you doing to me? But you don't start there, right? You don't start with jumping off a cliff into a perfect tuck roll into a sprint. You start with, walking barefoot on a trail, or maybe walking in minimal shoes on a trail, or wherever. What are some of the kind of benchmarks that you guys use, or some of the big targets in MovNat when you're introducing somebody to the system?
So to your first point, the idea of not starting in potentially hazardous conditions is a big part of what we do, and we systemize it in the same way that lifting a super heavy load with no experience is dangerous, right? You don't throw on someone's max load on day one. So we think about training variables the same way a strength and conditioning professional would. Usually a strength and conditioning professional is manipulating volume and intensity over time to improve someone's ability to do something, to execute something, whether it's strength or conditioning. We do the exact same thing, but we just include the third training variable, which is complexity. So we call it VIC, volume, intensity, and complexity. So the gym is a perfect example of a totally not complex environment. It's very simple. It's very sterile. Mm-hmm. Now you can introduce elements into the gym to make it a little bit more complex, pretty simply. And over time you can make it a little more complex on a trail, and even more complex off a trail, and more complex at being slippery or out. So we progress that in the same way. And I'll say not everybody wants to train in nature, and that's okay. That's kind of our inspiration, our source. But that was what I saw on my retreat with Erwan. That was really the gem out of the whole thing to me. It wasn't just the system. It wasn't just the awesome outdoor, super kind of aggro part of it. It was really that I saw from my 50 and 60-year-old clients things that they can do that they're not currently doing, like being able to, just the idea of balance, being able to work on balance in a systematic way, being able to get up off the ground in a systematic way and think about how to improve that, being able to sit on the ground. Most people can't even do that without a totally, we're thinking about mobility and flexibility all the time, but I feel like there's like a lot simpler solutions than we create out there. It's like, can you sit on the ground and have an upright spine? If you can't, it's probably because your your spine is doing the work that your hips can't do. If you can't hang, with basically like a child would, with basically a vertical spine, it's probably because your spine is doing the work that your shoulders can't do. So with these basic, simple things like sitting and hanging, if we don't just use them as like a starting point and immediately load them and turn them into a more crazy dynamic movement, there's a lot of benefit for anybody, for especially people that are aging and really need the full spectrum of progression, not just starting with the deadlift. So that's a big part of what we do, is thinking about volume, intensity, complexity, and using simplicity and practical movements to help people. And so that's what I'm really passionate about with MovNat. So yeah, it's the second point on the benchmarks. We have performance benchmarks on our site to where first of all, we just like any other complex or comprehensive system, we have an assessment which includes like basic movements, basic practical movements, like what does it look like when you sit on the ground in cross sit position and side bent sit position, which is sort of like the shin box 90-90 position. Can you put a 2x4 on the ground and walk 8 feet forward and backward without falling off? Can you step over something without rounding your spine? Really simple, basic things. What does it look like if you go to lift a very submaximal weight, like off the ground? What do you do? Mm-hmm. What that does is it gives us a starting point, and it also gives our trainers an opportunity to show off how they coach too. So it's kind of like a 2-in-1 system there. And it's also a way to measure and create a starting point. And then as far as benchmarks, like our beginner level benchmarks are being able to do basic things in all the different movement domains. So being able to get up a couple different ways off the ground, especially without using your hands, which a lot of people can't do. Being able to squat deeply, being able to crawl for, say, 2 minutes with a couple obstacles. Being able to execute a deadlift with good technique and carry something X amount of distance. These are all being able to do a basic downward jump, which, for a 50-year-old might just be a foot off the ground, and be able to land softly with efficiency. So yeah, we have some performance benchmarks, and they're a great way to just gauge and measure progress without it being overly quantified.
A lot of those skills, I think, have become a lot more important over the past, several decades as our environment that we've created for ourselves has become more and more advantageous to doing only one thing, which is what we're doing right now, sitting down and looking at a computer screen. Basic stuff, the basic unsexy stuff, right? Like getting up and down off the ground and crawling and that sort of thing. It's not very exciting, compared to playing football or the CrossFit games or something like that. But
Or
because we spend
1,000 followers on Instagram, right?
right. You're not. I say all the time, like I do a lot of stuff that I can't post on Instagram because it's just really boring. Like going out and running for an hour at like sub maximal pace, really damn boring. Not a very good Instagram video, but necessary to develop a part of my body that's not going to be developed by the rest of my life, which is a lot of time hunched over a keyboard. So I have to get out and do those things. How much and how often, I guess, is the thing that I'm kind of getting toward, because the fun stuff that attracts people, the stuff that gets the Instagram followers, is the stuff that's going to keep people coming back because of, just the psychological attraction of it. Whereas, crawling and getting up off the ground with skill and grace is hugely necessary. But how much of it do we need to do? How many times do I have to take my vitamins before I can go and eat the ice cream? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's really about progression, and it's about treating movement like you would a martial art. Really, again, all roads lead back to martial arts for me.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
when I started in jiu-jitsu, I could go out there and sort of hold my own just because I had some wrestling, but I would just get destroyed. But I would watch people who were brand new to the sport, and sometimes they would come in, and if the instructor just sort of let them go, they would basically come out with a beet red face. They'd get submitted like 10 times, and they'd be totally either putting themselves at risk for injury, or they'd just be discouraged because they didn't do too well right away. But if you approach it like the basics, the basics of movement are those type of things: sitting on the ground, moving on the ground, crawling, lifting, carrying, throwing, catching, all these basic things. So if you maintain the basics and you get really good at the basics, it just becomes an upward progression from there. So in the same way with jiu-jitsu, you shrimp every single time. With wrestling, you do basic takedowns every single time. Can you get flashier, fancier, sexier, do some big high amplitude throws and all that kind of stuff? Yeah, you learn that stuff, but it's just a process. But so I would say that, like, how long does it take to get you there? It depends on the individual, where you're at. Like, am I going to have a 60-year-old man be vaulting on week 3? Probably not. Or even doing any type of high amplitude jump that would be Instagram worthy? Not really. But can we work on a jump or even some of the principles of vaulting, which can be done on the floor? Absolutely. We can be working on that, and also broadening out our base of general movement competence. So I think it's really about the perspective there. If you have this perspective of earning movement, you can take it to unlimited places. If you're really anxious to get to the sexy stuff, you're just increasing your probability of getting hurt or just doing it in a suboptimal, not as well as you could. I do find though that people that have the right mindset get there very quickly, because at the end of the day, we all bring baggage to the table. We've been sitting in an elevated chair staring down at something, whether it's your desk, your homework, or whatever, and being told to sit still or just kind of be in our brains since we were probably 7 years old. Mm-hmm. So even if you were, privileged enough to play a sport and be actually good at it, that was your outlet for physicality, right? After the age of 7, which, is a narrow set of skills that you've learned, right? And gotten really good at. So it doesn't really matter what your background is. If you're a modern day person, you bring a lot of baggage to movement. That's why someone like Gray Cook would say even high level athletes are master compensators, right? So how do we get rid of those compensations? How do we approach movement in a way that's different from just going straight to the sexy stuff or trying to just do physical therapy? And that is, we just get back to our roots. We continue the process that we started when we were younger, which is we just move and we let our environment sharpen us. in the absence of a pure natural environment, human input's a good thing. Being coached, being told like, oh, hey, try it this way. This technique will work better than what you're doing. That's another part of that's even in hunter-gatherer culture. There was a lot of that too, like humans helping humans do something better. So I think that it really comes down to, getting back to our roots, getting back to natural movement, having somebody coach you through this, and just having that, that perspective of understanding that, just like with fat loss, like if you haven't been eating well for the last 20 years, it's going to take a little bit of time to get back to that. I know it's an extremely hard thing to get, we live in that quick fix culture. It's hard to do. So as coaches, that's up to us to, balance that and find a way to work with each client.
Well, I think some of that is redefining what quick is, right? I always have to kind of talk people off a ledge when I'm working with them on fat loss, for instance, because they're like, oh, well, I only lost 2 pounds this week. I'm like, well, first of all, 2 pounds in a week is a lot. And second of all, if you keep that trend line going over a year, you're going to be where you want to be in only a year. And in the grand scheme of things, a phrase I use a lot that I've shamelessly stolen from another one of our guests on the show is the 60-year fitness plan. And in the span of 60 years, 1 year is a blip, Like, you don't remember how hard you worked in 2009. I mean, you might in the general sense, but it doesn't still like weigh you down. So if you get this done, if you stay on this path this year, then, it's not that big of a deal to work hard for a year. And likewise, it's not that big of a deal to take 15 or 20 minutes to work on natural movement patterns every day and then still go into your weightlifting practice or whatever it is that you like to do. So that's kind of the next thing I wanted to cover is how does the MovNat system dovetail with the things that people are already doing in the fitness space. So if somebody comes to you with all that baggage, right? So if they're a weightlifter, and weightlifters and martial artists are sort of notorious for carrying a set of niggling injuries around because of the demands of their sport, how do they layer in natural movement?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, a lot of what I've spoken about so far is kind of the purest philosophy of MovNat, right? Like you've already committed to this idea and you go head first in, and let's be realistic. Not many people are willing to give up whatever they're most passionate about and suddenly become a MovNatter, right? So I would say that there's a lot of people that, I like to look at actual real world examples. There's a lot of people who use MovNat as a supplement to their actual training, even though MovNat isn't by design a supplement. It can be, something that enhances whatever you're doing. And it, instead of, thinking about gaining your strength from MovNat, maybe you want way higher level strength than what's natural and higher level strength than what's biologically natural. Okay, cool. That's great. So what are the benefits of MovNat? I think it really depends on what you do. So if you're a strength guy, you're going to be thinking, well, MovNat would be great for flex. I hate stretching. I want to get more mobile. This seems like a more rational approach, or maybe something that I would enjoy doing. It's purposeful, it's practical, and I don't have to just sit there and stretch. For a yoga person, it might be the opposite. They're like, you know what? I don't want to be a meathead and lift weights and like grind through deadlifts. But this whole natural philosophy, and there's some strength built into it. Being able to pull yourself on top of something or hang and swing and all that requires some strength. So does lifting and objects like we do. Even crawling takes some strength if you're not a strength person. So I think it's first figuring out what you want out of the system. Like, do you want more mobility out of it, or do you want more strength, or do you want more conditioning, whatever? And then it's taking playing up those features of it. So for your audience, it's mostly going to be strength people, right? So I work with Brett McKay of the Art of Manliness, and he's a power lifter and competes competitively. So we work mostly on doing ground movement and deep squatting and balancing, because that's what he's totally missing in his training. Not super, he does a little bit of the jumping and agility based stuff just to get that in there, but we spend a lot of time on the mobility stuff. How does that actually look? Well, he's strength training 4 times a week. So 2 days a week, we do light ground movements, sometimes in longer sessions, like anywhere from, 10 to 40 minutes, sometimes in really short sessions, like just 5 minutes, get on the ground and move. And we have a lot of examples of just simple ground movements you can do. So that's sort of what it looks like. It's like you could just sort of add it in. For someone like myself who likes to stay on the stronger side, I'm naturally stronger. I love lifting. I love all that kind of stuff. I'll use it as my warm-up. So when I go into the gym, instead of just sort of cold starting or just doing some joint circles or whatever, I'll get on the ground and do some ground movement. And again, it's always practical movements. It's always like, I love the idea of it having a purpose. And ultimately, the cool thing about that is when you do movements that have purpose and practicality in not only natural environments, but urban or modern environments, they kind of become, it helps you connect the dots to how you can just use them in your life. So think about this. Should I stretch my hamstrings for 3 minutes to get the maximum effect? Or can I do ground movement where I'm going to get a dynamic stretch of my hamstrings? But if I sit in a couple different positions throughout the day, like while doing something else, like watching TV or, doing work or sitting at the computer, I sometimes do it on the ground. I'm going to actually be stretching my hamstrings now for a lot longer, and it's going to just have a better effect. So we approach it in a couple different ways. We can systemize it, we can add it to workouts, or we can just inject it into your daily life. And the more generally, the better, as long as you're, recovering properly.
Now you guys have workshops, you have coaching certifications, you have online coaching. Do you guys have a specialized MovNat line, like MovNat for powerlifters, MovNat for cyclists, MovNat for Brazilian jiu-jitsuers?
We currently don't. Our main thing is we do workshops and certifications, and we are in the process of doing some of those, though. So,
okay.
It'd be something that we're interested in, is like, if we could create a workshop for, let's say, powerlifters, there's a powerlifting gym, how can we get some of the benefits of natural movement specifically for us, and how can we focus on that? That's something that we're looking to get into for sure.
Now, I'm not a MovNatter yet, although you're making a persuasive argument for me to become one. I'm what they call a semi-professional dabbler, right? So I like to just try out a whole bunch of stuff and get super nerdy about it for a year or so, and then try other things. So one of the things that I've incorporated from watching guys like you and guys like Chandler Stevens, who's written a lot of stuff for us, is using animal movement patterns, natural movement patterns as a warm-up protocol, right? So I have a few canned warm-ups that I use when I go to the gym, and one of them involves some kettlebell movements, one of them involves a lot of medicine ball stuff, and the one I used yesterday before I did my weightlifting workout was a lot of crawling, forward and backward, up and down the side of the gym, in various crawling patterns. And I can tell our audience that it's those kinds of things, just variable movement patterns, like the kind of stuff that you're describing, has completely changed the way my body works and how good I feel before, during, and after a workout. Where can people look to find the sort of to find that sort of thing and kind of get a taste for MovNat maybe before they sign up for a workshop?
We have a couple different resources for that, for sure. I have on MovNat.com a whole from the ground up video series of 12 different videos, instructional on how to do some basic movements in MovNat. I have a ground movement series, which I call the primary sequence, and a restoration series that sort of follow along. It uses like a big circular mat, and that's all ground movement, including a little bit of crawling. We have just demo videos of what our different crawls look like, and just one like semantical point that we always clarify with from the MovNat lens anyway is like our crawling. Again, we don't think of them as animal crawls. That we always think of them as human crawls. So like we're not trying to mimic an animal. We're just remembering that we are an animal and we have certain locomotion patterns that work. So every crawl has a reason for it. So like why would a human being crawl? Why do you think? Why would a human being crawl?
Because you have to. Maybe you're in a restricted space, or you're being shot at, or something like that. Sure.
Yeah, that's one reason. Like the most simple thing would be just to get under something, right? You lower what you're doing is you're lowering your center of gravity, you're adding more points of support, and you're getting under something. Another way would be if you're crossing something slippery, you're adding more points of support, you're decreasing the moment arm on your center of gravity, and you're crossing something. So there's always a purpose for these movements. We have a bunch of different crawls in MovNat, but it's not like the leopard versus the panda crawl versus the lizard crawl. It's always like, oh, this crawl has this particular purpose. So just a little semantical point, but totally, like these movements are great for warm-ups. They're great for just engaging you, especially with that lens of technique, with understanding your center of gravity and what a point of support is, and what, these more biomechanical terms that we don't really talk about in lifting. And I'd start with just some of those basic resources. You can find a lot on MovNat.com, especially.
One of the things I find refreshing about MovNat specifically, because there are several sort of move your body through space kind of systems out there now, and they're gaining traction, which I think is really good. One of the things I find really refreshing is that you guys are taking a biomechanical approach. Some of the systems that are out there tend to be a little esoteric, right? They're a little too hippie for me, and I say that as a guy who currently has his winter beard on, so I look like a giant hippie. But but you guys are taking a scientific approach to this. You guys are using the scaffolding of the strength and conditioning world and using that to explain what you guys are doing. How did that come to be? Has the system always been like this, or is this something that you helped introduce when you came on board as a performance director?
Yeah, so Erwan, definitely took George Herbay's concept and expanded on it. And one of those expansions was, I'd say to people when they come to a seminar, if there's nothing else you take away from this, it's going to be the formation and technique model, and just thinking about your body in terms of biomechanics. That being like simple things like center of gravity, base of support, understanding how to explain movement through basic terms, head, shoulders, knees, and toes versus like muscles, right? Mm-hmm. So we're taught as strength and conditioning professionals because we're trying to, improve strength, which is tied to muscle. We think like, engage your lat, but like when you think about how to actually improve something, like let's say I'm going to learn how to do whatever, throw a football. I've never heard a coach say something like, I want you to externally rotate your arm, and I want you to engage your lat, and I want you to engage your obliques as you rotate. Like nobody does that, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just getting back to the basics of learning how to coach through a language that is very intuitive, user-friendly, and positional based, really. So that's what biomechanics are. It's just basically understanding position in your body in a lot of ways. It's a part of it anyway. So understanding how force affects your body, and so that's kind of the gem, I think, of MovNat, is looking through a different lens. It's great to understand anatomy and physiology and kinesiology from understanding muscles and how it's all connected, but remembering movement's actually kind of simple, and how you use what language you use is really important. Then the formation and technique model is just putting these important pieces together to form technique. Again, position, breathing. Breathing is huge, something that we don't really talk about, other than you should be diaphragmatically breathing. But when you're lifting, you should be, using biomechanical breathing. Like that's kind of the basics of what we teach, but or what, again, most professionals teach. With MovNat, we go through a whole different thing. We're learning about how to breathe while we move. We're learning how to promote relaxation in the body as opposed to tension for submaximal movements. Mm-hmm. And then, again, sequence and timing and the balance of tension and relaxation. So these are all things that are super beneficial and relevant as a trainer. They have a scientific basis to them. They were added right from the get-go of like, how do we develop efficiency? Well, these are the things we do to improve efficiency. We adjust these and tweak these things to create efficiency. Mm-hmm. And then, someone like myself, what I added was just organizing and systemizing it in a way that really made sense from a developmental perspective, like really bringing in the ground movement and systemizing it and thinking about what steps, if somebody's 60, would we take to get them from A to B in a way that's safe and mostly effective, or the most effective way possible.
A lot of the things that you're talking about are things that most people don't think that they need to work on, right? Breathing, crawling, getting up and down off the ground. I don't think it can be overstated that our movement literacy has been completely lost. And it's been lost for a whole bunch of reasons. It starts with, the de-emphasis of physical education in schools, and it continues through, the paradigm of modern employment, which is sit down and be quiet for 8 to 10 hours a day. So what you're doing is really necessary. But there's another side to this that I kind of want to look at, which is the democratization of fitness. Right now, most fitness pursuits in America are sort of the privilege of the well-to-do, if you will. CrossFit gym memberships are very expensive. If you want to be a cyclist, let me tell you about how expensive it is to get into cycling. I have the credit card bills to prove it. But MovNat is something that can be done and should be done anywhere, right? So how can this play into sort of moving the conversation of fitness in America to something that's more accessible for people?
Yeah, I think that's really a great point. And to a degree, there's always going to be that need that if you're going to need to improve something, it's the way our society works, is you're probably going to have to pay, at least in the beginning, to have somebody who has this knowledge and experience to help you do it. So I don't think that it'll ever, I don't want to say it won't ever, but to start, the way things are set up right now, there's a real need for fitness professionals. And that's why a MovNat certification isn't free, right? It's something that, we have to support a business. You have to support a business as a professional. You have to charge what you need to charge. But ultimately, the greater message of MovNat is, like if you show up to a workshop or you show up to a MovNat gym or whatever it is, you're not getting hooked on this idea that you need to spend a lot of really money on anything. In some ways that hurts us because a lot of people, when they get involved with something new, they want to spend a lot of money on it, and we don't really have anything to buy after that, which can be difficult for some people. But at the end of the day, you're learning that all you really need is a body, which everyone has, and an environment, which everyone has to some degree. It's learning how to frame it in a way where you feel like you're getting something done and you're living a healthy life without having to be obsessive about it, right? Mm-hmm. We have a colleague named Katie Bowman who does this really well, like thinking about how to become fitter, just, for somebody who's limited either on finances or they're a mom and they're really stuck at home. How do you just add more movement into your life? How do you think about what you're doing and maybe not rely so much on technology and convenience to get a lot of rigorous, robust movement in, enough to be healthy? And that's what we're looking at.
You're really onto something. It's finding freedom in movement in a way that's not expensive and in a way that's going to enrich your life. And there is going to be an upfront cost, but there doesn't have to be an ongoing cost.
Yeah, so really it's about health too. It's also reframing what it means to be healthy, because most people come to fitness because they're not necessarily looking for that max deadlift that they can brag about or whatever. A lot of people who come to us have no interest in starting an Instagram account and showing off how awesome they are at movement. They're not that into it, honestly. So we're really tapping into a subset of people who are kind of turned off by the gym. Yeah. They're like, you know what? I want to live a healthy life, and I know that movement is a really important part of that. So what MovNat's doing is we're showing those people, like, you don't have to go to a gym if you don't want to go to a gym. You just really need to understand how to move your body and to move it and to engage in your environment, to understand that the inertia of society would have you not move. So this is how you think about, this is how to move your body in a safe way, and just give a different perspective on the importance of movement and how to fit it into your life. And also that you don't have to be the best at anything to be really deeply healthy. If anything, it's usually the opposite. The better you are at something, unfortunately, the more you specialize, the more a lot of other things go to hell, right? So the more we can unspecialize, decompartmentalize our movement, the more we're going to actually be more robust and healthy.
How has this changed your view of the world, right? So since I've gone from the overweight smoker that I was to being fitnessy stuff all the time, I go to places like airports and I watch people standing still on the moving sidewalk, right? And Atlanta Airport is my favorite place to watch this, because people stand still and then they catch you looking at them and then they start walking. It's very fun. You should try this experiment sometime. So how do you look at things different, or maybe look at environments differently since you've gotten into MovNat?
Well, for me, really what it's done for me is just free me of what I kind of felt like now that I realized was shackles with fitness. I kind of felt like to be fit, to feel good in my body, to be strong, to be, to have abs, to be able to lift a reasonable amount of weight, to be a man, that I had to put in hard time in the gym, and it was sort of like never going to end. It was just like, I'm going to be on this slow decay for the rest of my life. I'm going to fight, the muscle atrophy and testosterone loss until I'm, near my deathbed. And that was the perspective I had. It was like kind of fighting this idea that I'm decaying, right? So, and that shifted with MovNat a big time. Like I don't, with the flexibility of MovNat, I can MovNat anywhere and I could do it at any time. And I just sort of gauge my body and realize like I can maintain a very high level of fitness. I'm very happy with my physique. I really have not lost that much muscle or weight or anything like that. And I can just, I still structure my workouts to a degree, but I can be more playful and relaxed in my pursuits. It's also just taught me to engage deeply with my environment. Like I was never fully content with this idea of going outside and just being a little tourist, walking on a trail, right? And like summiting a peak, and that's with my expensive gear on. Like I like to go deeper, like step off the trail, get in there a little more. It just profoundly affects your experience when you kind of get back there a little more. I don't know, maybe that's the explorer in me, but that's me. And I would just say that like for my clients, I've worked with, in the Connecticut area, a lot of CEOs and people, executives and such, and it changes their perspective on what they're capable of in a lot of ways, So I had an architect who was in his 60s, and he was so proud of himself with his newfound abilities that like he would climb up on walls on job sites, and like the younger bucks couldn't even get up on top of him. Or he'd like in the middle of a business meeting crawl under his desk and pop up in the center for like during a display or whatever. And it really just made him come alive in a lot of ways, because I think deep down there's a child in all of us that loves to just play and engage in our environment. Movement is so human. It's I like to look at kids as like they're pretty good movers. We look at them as like, oh my God, they're so good. But it's like, no, kids are just a beautiful display of the drive to move, to explore, to get out there and to have fun. And in a lot of ways, that's what we at MovNat wake back up, is that it's like, you know what, I want to engage in my environment. I'm not going to do this as work or a number that I'm trying to attain. I'm going to view this as, I'm going to really enjoy movement again. I'm going to really engage with my environment and explore and find a lot of freedom through that. It's again, you might not see that fully in a MovNat video when you look at it, but when you experience it, you're like, wow, yeah, this is what I did when I was 5, and it was amazing, and now I understand why it's important.
It's definitely something that scratches a deep-seated need I think it's part of our biology. I mean, this is something that's wired into us at the genetic level to go do these things, to run and jump and climb and swing and throw stuff. And it has to, to me, the profound evidence of that is that it has to be beaten out of us, right? All of those tendencies have to be drilled out of us so that we can become, polite members of a productive society. But at some point, that pendulum has swung too far, and we need to kind of get back to that.
And I think there's a deep drive for men, especially, to be capable, right? Just be truly capable, like not, I think it's manifested through the gym. It's kind of an outlet that we have. It's the best outlet that we have in a lot of ways, but tying back to the vital component of MovNat, that being able to like physically save somebody else's life, like you can think you could do that until you get into those circumstances. For example, at the retreat I went to with Erwan, someone almost drowned, and he without hesitation went out there and saved that person. While we were all just standing there kind of befuddled and scared. And his point was, it was very convenient. I don't know if he paid that person. But his point was like, if you're not physically capable, you're going to make the situation a lot worse. You're not going to help anything. And the only way to be truly capable in real life scenarios where you need to lift up human beings and carry them, where you need to make big jumps or be precise with how you move, and where that precision makes the difference between life or death, is to actually practice those type of things as closely as possible. So I really think it taps, especially with men, in this idea of like feeling really proud and confident that you can. Because in MovNat we have aquatics, we have combatives. It's this whole spectrum of capability. So it gives you this sense of confidence that I used to have as a martial artist, but more so I have even more now. Because even as a martial artist, I was so broken I couldn't run at all. Now I can run really far, not fast. I'm not going to win any marathons by any means, but this fact that I have a broader skill set, and I'm very competent with all these different skill sets, just makes me walk around a little more confident, a little more real in my abilities, and it's a cool thing. I think it's a thing that's kind of missing in the industry a little bit. I think we direct our pursuits sometimes into superficial things, like I'm a man because I have these awesome abs, or I have these big shoulders or biceps, or I'm a man because look at my deadlift. And those are all great things. I'm not trying to, take away from that in any way, but I think there's a drive there for at least some or most to be capable, and that's what MovNat scratches pretty well.
I think that's an awesome way to go out on the show. The website is movnat.com, MovNat.com. Danny, where should people go to find and follow your work online?
Let's see. I am on Instagram, the new big platform everybody's on. So it's at natural.mover. And that's, other than that, everything I do is directed through MovNat.
Great. And people should get on the site. There's so much cool stuff, and there's just jaw-dropping videos of people moving through nature that you'll look at and be inspired. Danny, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you sitting down with us today, and look forward to working with you again.
Pete, thanks so much. This has been great.